Hello, everyone. Have you ever had a single day at work that so profoundly rocked your understanding of your job, your country, and yourself that you were never quite the same person again? I have. And it started with a memo. The air in Langley in May of 1973 was thick enough to taste. It tasted of stale coffee, paranoia, and the slow, grinding decay of the Nixon administration. Watergate wasn't just a storm on the horizon, it was a hurricane making landfall directly over Washington, and we at the Central Intelligence Agency were battening down the hatches. Every conversation in the cafeteria was a low murmur. Every glance in the hallway was a risk assessment. Trust, the currency of our world, had seen its value plummet overnight. I was Arthur Vance, a mid-level analyst in the Directorate of Operations, a 20-year man who had started my career with the ink still wet on Eisenhower's second-term inauguration speech. I believed in the mission. I believed we were the necessary shield in the long twilight struggle against Soviet expansionism. Our work was vital, often thankless, and always secret. I had accepted the moral ambiguities of my profession as a patriot's burden. I thought I knew the parameters, the lines we would bend but never break. I was a fool. The summons came on a Tuesday. A crisp single-page memorandum on the heavy bond paper reserved for the director's office. Mr. Vance, my office, 1400 hours. JRS. James R. Schlesinger, the new DCI. He was an outsider, an academic, an economist from the Office of Management and Budget, brought in by Nixon a few months prior to clean house after Richard Helms was pushed out. Schlesinger was known to be abrasive, brilliant, and possessed of zero sentimentality for the agency's storied past. He walked the 7th floor of the original headquarters building like a hawk circling a field of unsuspecting mice. When you were called to his office, it wasn't for a commendation. I spent the next 2 hours mentally reviewing every project I'd touched for the last 5 years, searching for the error, the miscalculation, the fatal flaw that was about to end my career. I straightened my tie for the 10th time and presented myself to his secretary, a woman with a stare that could freeze helium. She nodded me in without a word. Schlesinger's office was Spartan, a rejection of the old boy Anglophile decor favored by his predecessors. He was behind his large mahogany desk, not lounging but perched, like he was ready to spring. He didn't offer me a seat. "Vance," he began, his voice a dry rasp. "You have a reputation, meticulous, discreet, no political axe to grind. You love this agency, but you're not a cultist. Is that a fair assessment?" I managed "Yes, sir. I believe so." He leaned forward, his glasses catching the light. "The walls are closing in. The Watergate committee is sniffing around, and they're not just looking for burglars. They're looking for a secret history. They're looking for us. Before they find it, I want to find it. I want to know every skeleton in every closet on every floor of this building." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "I am issuing a directive to all senior operating officials, past and present. They are to report to me in writing any and all activities they were ever a part of that might be construed as, shall we say, outside the legislative charter of this organization." My blood ran cold. He was asking for a confession, a collective, institutional confession. "Sir," I started, "the potential blowback from such a directive—" He cut me off with a sharp wave of his hand. "Is precisely what I'm trying to preempt, Vance. I can't fight a ghost. I need to know what's real. And that's where you come in." He finally gestured to the chair in front of his desk. I sat. "The responses to this directive will not come to my desk. They will not go through standard channels. They will come directly to you. You will be provided a secure room. No secretaries, no aides, just you. You will read every single word of every single submission. You will collate them. You will summarize them. You will create a single comprehensive report on the entire history of this agency's questionable deeds. You are to be my eyes on our own dark side. No one will know what you are doing except for you and me. The project requires a name. For now, we'll refer to it as the Family Jewels, because they're priceless and they're ours. I sat there, stunned into silence. He was asking me to be the priest in the CIA's confessional, to hear the sins of men I considered legends, to document the very things we had all spent our lives ensuring would never see the light of day. It was the most dangerous, most sensitive, and most terrifying assignment of my life. I knew, even then, that whatever I found in that room would change me forever. My belief, my patriotism, my carefully constructed worldview, all of it was about to be put on trial. I said the only thing I could. I understand, Mr. Director. Leaving his office, the normal paranoia of the Langley hallways felt quaint, almost childish. I was walking back to my desk, but I was really on my way to a small, windowless room where the soul of the Central Intelligence Agency was waiting for me, written on thousands of pages of yellowing paper. The day the CIA's darkest secrets hit the desk was the day they landed on mine. My secure room was a converted storage closet in the sub-basement, a space so anonymous it was practically invisible. It had a single steel door with a new Medeco lock, a metal desk, a lamp, a chair, and a heavy-duty safe. The only other object was a shredder the size of a small refrigerator. My instructions were simple: read, synthesize, and destroy the originals once I had extracted their content for the final report. The first week was deceptively quiet. A few thin envelopes arrived by special courier. I'd sign for them, lock the door, and sit down to read. The initial submissions were almost laughable, bureaucratic CYA of the highest order. An operations chief admitting he'd used agency funds to buy a case of scotch for a foreign contact without filing the proper reimbursement form. A station chief confessing to a minor bit of blackmail against a low-level functionary in a European port city to get better docking privileges. It was embarrassing, slightly sordid stuff, but it was all within the realm of what I expected. It was the cost of doing business in the shadows. I began to relax. Perhaps Schlesinger was overreacting. Perhaps the family jewels were just costume jewelry, gaudy but ultimately fake. I started to develop a routine. Coffee, lock the door, read the day's submissions, type up my notes on a secure standalone typewriter, lock the notes in the safe, and shred the source documents. It was almost peaceful, a monastic existence dedicated to the agency's minor transgressions. Then, on a Friday afternoon, a heavy footlocker arrived. It wasn't an envelope. It was a metal-bound trunk that took 2 men to carry. It came from the Directorate of Science and Technology. I signed for it with a growing sense of dread. Inside, nestled in aged manila folders, was the first true monster. It was a project codenamed Mkultra. I had heard whispers, of course. Vague rumors of experiments, of truth drugs. But the reality, spelled out in dry scientific language, was a descent into madness. The documents detailed a sprawling multi-million-dollar program to research mind control. They spoke of testing psychoactive drugs, most notably LSD, on unwitting American citizens. The words leapt off the page. Unwitting, terminal experiments, vulnerable populations. They weren't targeting enemy agents, they were targeting prisoners, drug addicts, and prostitutes. People who wouldn't be missed. People whose stories would never be believed. I read about CIA-funded brothels in San Francisco, codenamed Operation Midnight Climax, where Johns were dosed with LSD and observed from behind two-way mirrors. The clinical detachment of the reports was the most sickening part. They described psychotic breaks, terror, and lasting psychological damage not as human tragedy, but as data points. I felt a wave of nausea. This wasn't bending the rules. This wasn't a moral gray area. This was a violation of everything I believed our country stood for. This was the work of Dr. Mengele, not the Central Intelligence Agency. I read about the death of Frank Olson, an army biochemist working on the program who was secretly dosed with LSD and 9 days later fell to his death from a New York hotel window. The official report, a copy of which was in the file, called it a suicide. The project notes hinted at something far more sinister, a man who knew too much and was becoming a security risk. I spent the entire weekend in that windowless room, fueled by black coffee and a growing sense of horror. My hands shook as I typed my summary. The meticulous, dispassionate analyst in me was at war with the citizen, the human being who was reading this filth. This wasn't a family jewel, it was a cancerous tumor. By Monday morning, I was a different man. The naivety was gone, burned away by the horrors in that footlocker. When another courier arrived with a new batch of memos, I no longer felt a sense of duty. I felt a sense of foreboding. The next set of files came from the Domestic Operations Division, a name that in itself should have been a red flag. The CIA Charter explicitly forbids us from operating inside the United States, from spying on Americans. It's the one line we are never, ever supposed to cross. The FBI's turf, a sacred division of power. The files laid out in excruciating detail how that line had been obliterated. The program was codenamed Operation Chaos. It was DCI Helms's answer to President Johnson's, and later Nixon's, paranoid obsession that the anti-Vietnam War movement was being secretly funded and controlled by foreign powers, specifically the Soviets or the Chinese. The operation's goal was to prove this foreign link. For 7 years, the agency had systematically spied on American citizens. They had infiltrated peace groups, student organizations, and civil rights movements. They had placed undercover agents on college campuses. They compiled personality files on more than 7,200 Americans. The names were a who's who of the counterculture and the New Left. Activists, writers, student leaders, even a few members of Congress who had spoken out against the war. I saw indices, cross-references, reports from agents detailing private meetings, political strategies, and personal lives. They had found no evidence of significant foreign control. The reports stated it, again and again. The movement was homegrown, but the operation didn't stop. It grew. It became a self-perpetuating machine of domestic surveillance, all based on a presidential whim and a foundational lie. I thought of my own nephew, a student at Berkeley who had been to a few protests. Was his name in these files? Had some clean-cut young agent from the farm sat next to him in a student union, pretending to be his friend while taking notes? The betrayal felt personal. We, the guardians against foreign threats, had turned our weapons inward. We had treated our own citizens, our children, our neighbors, as the enemy. The sheer arrogance of it was breathtaking. The memos revealed that we had opened mail, wiretapped phones, and conducted surreptitious entries, burglaries, against American anti-war groups. All of it illegal, all of it a direct assault on the Constitution I had sworn to protect. I typed up my summary of chaos, my fingers pounding the keys with a cold fury. The safe in my little room was getting full. It no longer felt like a place to protect secrets. It felt like a tomb where the corpse of the agency's honor was being interred, piece by piece. and I was the undertaker. The flow of documents became a torrent. It seemed that Schlesinger's directive had broken a dam of silence, and decades of pent-up secrets were now flooding my subterranean office. The papers piled up on my desk, each folder a new chapter in a book I wished I'd never opened. My world had shrunk to the hum of the ventilation, the clack of the typewriter, and the rustle of paper that spoke of unforgivable things. The next major revelation came from a series of folders marked with a simple, chillingly bland title, Executive Action. It was the agency's euphemism for assassination. My training had taught me that the United States did not engage in such practices. It was what the KGB did. We were the good guys. The files told a different story. They were a catalogue of plots, both failed and successful, to eliminate foreign leaders who had fallen out of favor with Washington. The first ones I read concerned Fidel Castro. If it hadn't been so deadly serious, it would have been a black comedy. The plots were a bizarre collaboration between the buttoned-down Ivy Leaguers of the agency and the most notorious figures of the American mafia. I read memos detailing meetings between CIA case officers and mobsters like Johnny Roselli and Sam Giancana, men the Justice Department was simultaneously trying to put in prison. The agency wanted to use the mob's expertise in murder and their connections in Cuba to get to Castro. The schemes were almost cartoonish. There was the plan to contaminate Castro's cigars with botulinum toxin, so he would die the moment he put one to his lips. There was the idea to plant an exploding seashell at his favorite diving spot. There was the plot to gift him a diving suit dusted with a fungus that would cause a chronic skin disease. And most famously, there were the poison pills, handed off to a Cuban contact who, at the last minute, lost his nerve. The plots failed, one after another, in an almost farcical display of incompetence. But the intent was there, recorded in cold, bureaucratic prose. The elimination of a foreign leader was discussed with the same emotional detachment as a proposal to build a new listening post. But it wasn't just Castro. The files moved on to other darker successes. I read about Rafael Trujillo, the brutal dictator of the Dominican Republic. For years, he was our man in the Caribbean. When he became a liability, the agency supplied weapons, 3 M1 carbines and 3 pistols, to a group of dissidents. The memos were careful. They didn't say, "We armed the assassins." They said, "Material support was provided to a dissident faction." But the result was the same. In May 1961, Trujillo's car was ambushed and he was gunned down. His blood was on our hands. Then there was Patrice Lumumba, the first democratically elected Prime Minister of the Congo. He was seen as a charismatic nationalist, potentially leaning toward the Soviets. That was his death sentence. The files contained a cable from the station chief in Leopoldville that made my breath catch in my throat. It described a plan, approved at the highest levels in Washington, to inject a deadly biological agent into Lumumba's food or his toothpaste. The plot was never carried out because Lumumba was captured and killed by his political rivals first, but the intent, the authorization to commit murder, was there in black and white. It was a standing order from the very top of the American government. I felt physically ill. I had to get up and pace the small room, my heart hammering against my ribs. This wasn't about defending America. This was about imperial arrogance. It was about deciding who lived and who died in other countries based on our own political convenience. The men who wrote these memos, the men who approved these operations, they were the same men whose portraits hung in the hallways upstairs. They were the architects of the agency, the legends, and they were conspirators to murder. My job was to synthesize, to be objective. But how could I be objective about this? I typed the summary for the executive action chapter of my report. I listed the names: Castro, Trujillo, Lumumba, and others. I detailed the methods, the code words, the approvals. Each keystroke felt like a betrayal. I was betraying the myth of the agency I had served for 20 years, but to ignore it, to hide it, would be a greater betrayal, a betrayal of the truth and of the country the agency was supposed to be protecting. The secrets were becoming a physical weight. When I left the building at night, I felt like I was carrying ghosts with me. The city of Washington, with its monuments to liberty and justice, seemed like a facade, a beautiful stage set behind which a very different and very ugly play was being performed. And I was now one of the few people who had read the script. The deeper I dug, the more I realized that the family jewels were not just a collection of isolated incidents, but a mosaic of a single, overarching pathology. A belief within the agency that it was exempt from the laws and ethics that governed everyone else. It was a culture of impunity, nurtured in the shadows of the Cold War, and sanctioned by a succession of presidents who wanted plausible deniability. The next set of files to land on my desk dealt with a different kind of violation, one that was less violent than assassination, but in its own way, just as corrosive to the fabric of a free society. These were the mail opening programs. For over 2 decades, from 1953 to 1973, the CIA had been illegally intercepting and opening the private mail of American citizens. The main project, based in New York City, was codenamed H.T. Lingaol. Its target was first-class letters moving between the United States and the Soviet Union. The mechanics of the operation were described in painstaking, logistical detail. CIA agents would identify specific mailbags at the airport, divert them to a secret workshop, and there, specialists would carefully steam open the envelopes, photograph their contents with high-speed cameras, and then reseal them so skillfully that the recipients would never know their privacy had been violated. They processed, at their peak, thousands of letters a year. The files contained copies of some of the intercepted mail. I sat there in my basement room and read the private correspondence of ordinary people. A young woman writing to her lover in Moscow, a scientist exchanging academic papers with a colleague, a grandmother sending birthday wishes to her grandchild, a businessman trying to arrange a trade deal. It was a raw, unfiltered slice of human life, and we had stolen it. We had violated one of the most basic sanctities of a free nation, the privacy of one's own mail, on a massive industrial scale. The justification, as always, was national security. They were looking for hidden codes, for the names of Soviet agents, for any scrap of intelligence. And while they occasionally found small items of interest, the overwhelming majority of the mail was exactly what it appeared to be: innocent, personal communication. The program created a vast database. The agency compiled a watch list of people whose mail was to be targeted, and the list grew to include not just suspected intelligence targets, but also peace activists, academics, and even prominent figures like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and the author John Steinbeck. The arrogance was staggering. Who gave us the right to read John Steinbeck's mail? It was a star chamber proceeding, with no judge, no jury, and no appeal. Your name went on a list in a secret file, and your private life became an open book to a government spy. Another program, SR Pointer, did the same thing with mail to and from communist China, operating out of San Francisco. A third, smaller project targeted mail to and from Latin America. It was a global enterprise of illegal surveillance. As I typed up the summary, I thought about the fundamental trust between a government and its people. That trust is built on the belief that there are lines the government will not cross, that the state's power has limits. These programs hadn't just crossed the line. They had erased it and paved it over. The men and women who ran these mail-opening operations probably saw themselves as patriots, as diligent soldiers on the front lines of the Cold War. They would come to work, steam open some letters, photograph them, and go home to their families in the suburbs, never once questioning the fundamental illegality and immorality of their daily task. It had become normal, and that was the most frightening part. The normalization of the unthinkable. The safe in my room was now crammed with these summaries: Macultra, chaos, executive action, HTL lingual. Each one was a body blow to my idealism. I was no longer just an analyst. I was an archaeologist, excavating the ruins of the agency's integrity. And with each new artifact I unearthed, I felt more and more like an accomplice after the fact. The weight of this knowledge was isolating. I couldn't talk to my wife about it. I couldn't have a drink with a colleague and vent. I was a silo of toxic information. I started having trouble sleeping. When I did sleep, I dreamed of letters that wouldn't open and men with no faces watching me from behind two-way mirrors. The job was hollowing me out, replacing my sense of purpose with a cold, hard knot of disillusionment. I still had more files to get through. The footlockers and envelopes kept coming, a seemingly endless conveyor belt of institutional sin. And I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that the worst was yet to come. My small, windowless room had become a confessional for ghosts. The spirits of abused prisoners, of murdered leaders, of ordinary citizens whose lives had been secretly upended, all seemed to gather there, their stories whispering from the pages I held in my hands. I had read about mind control, domestic spying, assassinations, and illegal mail opening. I thought I had seen the worst of it. But the family jewels had one more circle of hell to show me, a place where the lines between intelligence gathering and sheer criminality dissolved completely. The files detailed a series of surreptitious entries. In plain English, burglaries, black bag jobs. The agency had, on numerous occasions, broken into private property both at home and abroad. They weren't just targeting foreign embassies, which was a risky but understood part of the espionage game. They were targeting American citizens. One file detailed the break-in at the office of a well-known Washington lobbyist who was representing a foreign government. The team that went in was looking for contracts and correspondence, information that would give the US government a negotiating advantage. They drilled the lock, photographed every document in the man's filing cabinets, and were out in under an hour. It was a perfect professional operation, and it was a felony. Another set of documents outlined the agency's relationship with a former New York City police officer. This man was, for all intents and purposes, a contract burglar for the CIA. When the agency needed something, a document, a codebook, a piece of blackmail material, from an office or apartment in Manhattan, they would call him. He had a network of safecrackers and second-story men. The memos spoke of him with a kind of professional admiration, praising his skill set and discretion. The CIA, the premier intelligence service of the United States, was using common criminals to conduct illegal break-ins on American soil. This wasn't just a violation of the Charter. It was a perversion of it. We were supposed to be catching criminals, not hiring them. The most disturbing case involved the Watergate scandal itself. As the investigation into the break-in at the Democratic National Committee headquarters heated up, I found a memo that made my blood run cold. It detailed how the agency had provided assistance to two of the Watergate burglars, E. Howard Hunt and Eugenio Martinez. Hunt was a former CIA officer, and the memo revealed that the agency had supplied him with disguises, wigs, glasses, and a speech-altering device, and photographic equipment from its Technical Services Division. The memo tried to spin it as a routine courtesy to a former employee, claiming the agency had no idea what he was planning to use it for. It was a lie, and a flimsy one at that. We had, however, unwittingly, aided and abetted the very crime that was now threatening to bring down the President of the United States. The irony was so thick I could barely breathe. The agency's own culture of secrecy and its willingness to operate outside the law had come back to haunt it in the most spectacular way possible. We had helped create the monster that was now at the gates. And then there were the wiretaps. The files were full of them. The agency had a long and sordid history of illegally tapping the phones of people it considered security risks. The most egregious examples targeted journalists. I read a summary of a wiretap placed on the home and office phones of two prominent newspaper columnists who had written articles critical of the agency's role in Vietnam. The surveillance went on for months. Every conversation they had, with sources, with editors, with their wives and children, was recorded and transcribed by CIA monitors. The transcripts were in the files, pages and pages of private lives laid bare. The goal was to identify their sources within the government, to plug the leaks. But it was also an act of intimidation, a clear message that criticism of the agency would not be tolerated. It was a tactic straight from the playbook of the secret police in some tin-pot dictatorship. We were using the tools of totalitarianism in the name of defending democracy. It was a contradiction that lay at the heart of everything I was discovering. I finished summarizing the files on burglaries and wiretaps. My report was growing into a monstrous document, a true and terrible history of the agency's first 25 years. It was a litany of abuses of power, of betrayals of public trust, of crimes committed in the name of patriotism. I felt a profound sense of exhaustion, a weariness that went bone deep. The man who had first walked into this room, the proud cold warrior, was gone. In his place was a man who knew too much, a man burdened by secrets that were not his own. I looked at the safe, now so full of my typed summaries that I could barely close the door. Schlesinger had called them the family jewels. I had come to think of them as the crown jewels of a rogue state. And I was their sole curator, the keeper of a collection that could destroy the institution I had given my life to. The day finally came when the last footlocker was empty, the last memo read and shredded. I sat in my silent subterranean room, the immense quiet pressing in on me. The only thing left was the report itself. It was nearly 700 pages long, a dense, single-spaced manuscript bound in a simple black binder. On the cover, I had typed a single title: Summary of Agency Activities Potentially Inconsistent with Charter. It was a sterile, bureaucratic title for a document that contained so much moral filth. Holding it felt like holding a block of lead. It had a physical and a spiritual weight that seemed to suck the very air out of the room. It was the product of weeks of relentless, soul-crushing work. I had done what Schlesinger asked. I had stared into the abyss, and the abyss had stared back. I read through it one last time, not as a compiler, but as a citizen. The sheer scope of it was staggering. MKUltra's drug experiments on unwitting Americans, Operation Chaos's spying on the anti-war movement, the HT Lingual mail opening program, the assassination plots against foreign leaders, the use of the mafia, the burglaries and illegal wiretaps, the assistance to the Watergate plotters. It was all there, laid out in my own dispassionate prose. It was a secret history of a secret war, a war fought not just against the Soviets, but against the law, against the Constitution, and against the very principles of the nation the CIA was created to defend. I felt a strange mixture of emotions. There was disgust, certainly, and a deep abiding sadness for what the agency had become. but there was also a sliver of pride. I had done the job I was asked to do. I had not flinched. I had recorded the truth, no matter how ugly. The report itself was a testament to the fact that, at least for this one moment, the agency was being forced to look at itself in the mirror. I called Schlesinger's office. His secretary put me through immediately. "It's done," I said, my voice hoarse. "Come up," he replied, and the line went dead. I placed the black binder in a locked briefcase, chained it to my wrist, and took the elevator to the 7th floor. The walk down the hallway to the director's office felt like the longest walk of my life. I felt the gaze of the portraits of past directors on me: Dulles, McCone, Helms, men whose sins I now knew in intimate detail. I was carrying their legacy in my briefcase. I entered Schlesinger's office. He was standing by the window, looking out over the wooded Virginia landscape. He turned as I came in, and his eyes went straight to the briefcase. "Let's see it," he said. I unlocked the case, took out the binder, and placed it on his polished mahogany desk. The black binder looked like a coffin on the smooth, reflective surface. He didn't open it right away. He just stared at it, his expression unreadable. He circled the desk, sat down, and placed his hands on the cover, as if sensing its contents by touch. "Give me the overview, Vance, the 30-second version." I took a deep breath. "Sir, it's worse than you thought. Substantially worse. We have engaged in systematic, illegal domestic spying. We have conducted medical experiments on American citizens without their consent. We have plotted the assassination of foreign leaders and provided the weapons to do it. We have burglarized the homes and offices of Americans. We have run a massive, illegal mail-opening enterprise for 20 years. And we provided material support to the Watergate burglars." I stopped, my voice trailing off. I had said it all out loud. The litany of shame. Schlesinger listened without flinching, his face a mask of grim concentration. He tapped a finger on the cover of the report. "So," he said, his voice low and hard, "these are the family jewels." He finally opened the binder and began to read my introduction. He read for several minutes in complete silence. The only sound in the room was the faint rustle of the page as he turned it. He looked up at me, his eyes sharp and intense. "You've done your country a service, Vance. A terrible, necessary service." He closed the binder. "This document will not leave this office. It will be secured in my personal safe. Thank you. You're dismissed." I walked out of his office, unchained the empty briefcase from my wrist, and returned to my own desk on the 4th floor. It was over. The knowledge was no longer mine alone. It had been passed on. I felt strangely empty. For weeks, I had a purpose, a terrible but clear mission. Now I was just an analyst again, but the world looked different. The familiar routines of the agency seemed like a charade. The men I passed in the hall were no longer just colleagues. They were potential authors of the memos I had read, or victims of them. The secret I had kept had isolated me, and now the absence of that secret left a void. I had been the keeper of the jewels, and now I was just a man who knew they existed, locked away in a safe on the 7th floor, a time bomb waiting to explode. Life at the agency tried to return to normal, but for me, it was impossible. The knowledge of the Family Jewels report was a ghost that haunted my every waking moment. I went through the motions of my job, analyzing intelligence from Eastern Europe, but my heart wasn't in it. Every report I wrote felt like a lie of omission, ignoring the deeper, darker truths I knew about my own organization. The summer of 1973 was a tense one. The Watergate hearings were dominating the news. John Dean's testimony about a cancer on the presidency felt eerily familiar. He was talking about the White House, but he could have been talking about the ugly contents of the black binder locked in Schlesinger's safe. Then, in July, the landscape shifted dramatically. Nixon, in a major cabinet shuffle, moved Schlesinger to Secretary of Defense and appointed William Colby as the new Director of Central Intelligence. My heart sank. Schlesinger was an outsider, a reformer who had wanted to lance the boil. Colby was the ultimate insider, a career operations man, a veteran of the OSS and the architect of the controversial Phoenix program in Vietnam. He was one of them. I was certain he would bury the family jewels so deep they would never be found. I imagined him taking my 700-page report and personally feeding it into an incinerator. The secrets would be safe again. I was wrong. Colby was a more complex man than I had realized. He was an insider, yes, but he also had a lawyer's mind and a deep, pragmatic understanding of the political firestorm that was coming. He knew that the secrets wouldn't stay buried forever. He believed it was better for the agency to confess its sins to its overseers than to have them dragged out, piece by piece, by a hostile press and Congress. Colby read the report. I wasn't there, but I heard later that he was deeply shaken by it, particularly by the domestic spying of Operation Chaos and the MKultra experiments. He knew that these were not just PR problems, they were potential death blows to the agency's legitimacy. The bomb finally went off on December 22, 1974. Seymour Hersh, a Bulldog reporter for the New York Times, published a front-page story under the headline, "Huge CIA Operation Reported in US Against Anti-War Forces." Hersh had gotten the core of the Operation Chaos story. He didn't have the Family Jewels report itself, but he had enough sources to expose the massive illegal domestic spying campaign. The article hit Washington like a thunderclap. The story was out. The dam had broken. From my desk at Langley, I watched the fallout with a sense of grim vindication. The agency went into lockdown. The press was in a feeding frenzy. Congress, already energized by Watergate, smelled blood. Colby was called to testify. He knew he couldn't lie. The Family Jewels report on his desk was a loaded gun, and Hersh's story had just pulled the trigger. In early 1975, Colby began to brief members of Congress and the Justice Department on the contents of my report. He admitted to the domestic spying. He admitted to the assassination plots. He admitted to the mail opening. He laid the agency's sins bare to its masters. The result was predictable and explosive. The Senate, led by Senator Frank Church, and the House, led by Representative Otis Pike, formed special committees to investigate the entire history of the U.S. intelligence community. The Church Committee and the Pike Committee became national sensations. For the first time, the American public was given a real look behind the curtain of its secret government. The hearings were televised. Former directors, station chiefs, and covert operators were forced to testify under oath about things they had spent their entire lives hiding. They talked about poison dart guns designed to induce heart attacks. They talked about hiring the mafia. They talked about reading the mail of student activists. It was my report, coming to life on the nightly news. I would watch the hearings from my living room, a strange sense of detachment washing over me. I knew the details before the witnesses even spoke them. I had read the source documents. I recognized the code words. I was the anonymous scribe of this national scandal. The Family Jewels, once the most closely guarded secret in Washington, were now public knowledge. Their sordid details spread across the front page of every newspaper in the country. The agency was being torn apart in public, and I, in my small secret way, had written the script for its dissection. The institution I had served, and in my own way loved, was being humiliated. But I knew it was a necessary humiliation, a painful but essential step toward accountability. The cancer had been exposed to the light. The question now was whether the patient would survive the surgery. The revelations of the church and Pike committees sent a shockwave through the American body politic. The public's trust in its government, already shattered by Vietnam and Watergate, was ground into dust. The myth of the CIA as a noble, incorruptible defender of freedom was replaced by the image of a rogue elephant, rampaging through the Constitution, accountable to no one. For those of us inside Langley, it was a time of profound crisis and introspection. The atmosphere was a toxic mix of anger, betrayal, and fear. Many of my colleagues felt that Colby had betrayed the agency by confessing its secrets. They saw the congressional investigations not as a necessary process of accountability, but as a politically motivated witch hunt that was crippling our ability to counter the Soviets. "They're tying our hands while the KGB is laughing," was a common refrain in the cafeteria. They weren't entirely wrong. The public spectacle did damage our operational capabilities and exposed sources and methods. But they were missing the larger point. The point I had come to understand so intimately in my basement office. The damage had been self-inflicted years before. The committees were merely diagnosing the disease we had allowed to fester for decades. I kept my head down and did my work. No one ever knew of my role in compiling the original report. I was just another anonymous analyst, watching the storm break over the building. But my perspective was unique. When a former operations chief testified about plotting to poison Lumumba's toothpaste, I remembered the dry clinical language of the memo he had written. When the details of Operation Midnight Climax were revealed, I remembered the sick feeling in my stomach as I read about the unwitting victims in that San Francisco safe house. The fallout was immense. New laws were passed. The Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, FISA, was created to require a warrant for wiretapping within the U.S. Permanent Intelligence Oversight Committees were established in both the House and the Senate, ending the era of the CIA being able to police itself. A presidential executive order was signed explicitly banning assassinations. These were the reforms, the new lines drawn in the sand, meant to prevent the abuses of the Family Jewels era from ever happening again. The agency was wounded, humbled. The old guard was purged. A new generation of officers came in, trained under a new set of rules that emphasized legal oversight and accountability. For a time, it seemed like real, lasting change had occurred. I retired a few years later, in the early 1980s. I left quietly, another grey man fading out of the grey world of intelligence. I never spoke of my work on the Family Jewels report, not even to my wife. It was a burden I carried alone. I watched from the sidelines as the decades passed. The agency slowly rebuilt its reputation. The Cold War ended, and new threats emerged. The specter of 9/11 brought a new era of fear and a new demand for aggressive intelligence operations. And with it, I saw the old arguments resurfacing. The arguments about necessity. The arguments that in order to fight monsters, we must be willing to become monstrous ourselves. I would read about enhanced interrogation techniques at black sites, about warrantless wiretapping of American citizens, about drone strikes in countries where we were not officially at war, and I would feel a cold chill of recognition. The language was different, the technology was new, but the underlying philosophy felt hauntingly familiar. It was the same logic that had justified MKUltra, that had greenlit Operation Chaos, that had authorized executive action. It was the belief that the ends justify the means, that the agency stands above the law in the defense of the nation. The full Family Jewels report My 700-page manuscript was finally declassified and released to the public in 2007, heavily redacted, but still shocking. I downloaded the PDF and read it. It was strange to see my own typewritten words, my sterile summaries of unspeakable acts, now available for anyone in the world to see. It was the final chapter in a story that had begun for me in a windowless room over 30 years before. Looking back, I see that the family jewels were both a poison and an antidote. They were the poison that had coursed through the veins of the agency for a generation. But their exposure, the terrible process of bringing them into the light, was also the only antidote. It forced a reckoning, however imperfect and temporary. The story of the family jewels is a timeless cautionary tale. It is a story about the seductive power of secrecy and the corrosive nature of unaccountable power. It reminds us that the people who are supposed to protect our freedoms can become the greatest threat to them if they are not watched, if they are not held to the same laws as the citizens they serve. The ghosts of those memos still linger. They are a permanent part of our history, a reminder of how easily a nation can lose its way in the shadows. And they pose a question that every generation of Americans must answer for itself. What lines are we willing to cross in the name of security? And what part of our soul are we willing to sacrifice in the process? Now I look back on that period of my life not with anger, but with a profound sense of melancholy. I was a man who believed in a noble cause, and I was forced to document its corruption from the inside. The process stripped me of my innocence, but it gave me a clarity that few people ever achieve. I saw the true face of power, not the idealized version we are taught in school, but the raw, messy, and often brutal reality of how it is wielded in the dark. The other analysts and agents I worked with were not, by and large, evil men. They were patriots by their own definition. They believed they were making the hard choices necessary to keep America safe during the most dangerous geopolitical struggle in human history. They saw the Constitution not as a sacred text, but as a set of peacetime luxuries that had to be occasionally set aside in a state of perpetual, undeclared war. That was their fundamental error. They convinced themselves that they lived on a different moral plane, that their actions were exempt from normal human judgment. And in doing so, they opened the door to horrors. The legacy of MKUltra is not intelligence. It is the shattered lives of its unwitting subjects. The legacy of Operation Chaos is not security. It is the deep wound of a government spying on its own people. The legacy of the assassination plots is not a safer world. It is the stain of murder on our national character. These were not the actions of a confident, righteous republic. They were the paranoid machinations of an empire that had begun to fear its own shadow. My role in this was small and secret. I was no hero. I was a bureaucrat, a record keeper. My only significant act was to not look away. I read every word, typed every summary, and created the honest, unvarnished record that Schlesinger demanded. I built the mirror that he then forced Colby and eventually the nation to look into. What we saw in that reflection was ugly, and it changed the country. The oversight committees, the new laws, the public debate, all of it grew from the seeds planted in that 700-page report. The reforms were a direct response to the abuses I had catalogued. But institutions have memory, and they also have a powerful impulse to revert to their old ways. The tension between security and liberty is eternal. Every crisis, every new threat, tempts us to slide back toward the shadows, to once again grant unseen agents the power to do unspoken things in our name. The allure of the necessary evil is powerful. I often wonder what family jewels memos are being written today, in secure servers and encrypted files. What new programs, justified by new fears, are currently bending and breaking the rules in ways that their authors believe are essential? History rarely repeats itself exactly, but it often rhymes. The names of the programs will be different, the targets will have changed, but the fundamental question of power and accountability remains the same. My generation learned the hard way that secrecy is not a shield. It is a breeding ground for abuses. The family jewels taught us that the most dangerous threats to a democracy can sometimes come from within, from the very people who have sworn to protect it. It is a lesson that must be relearned again and again. My final act in this silent drama was to shred the original memos. With each batch of paper I fed into the machine, I felt a strange sense of finality. I was destroying the evidence, but I was preserving the truth. The paper turned to confetti, but the words were now etched into my report and into my memory. They became a part of me. They are the ghosts I live with. They are the jewels of a crown I never wanted, a heavy inheritance of secrets that I will carry with me to my grave. The world is a complex place, and the defense of a nation is a dirty business. I know that. But the story of the family jewels serves as a permanent flashing red light, a warning that there is a line. And when a nation's guardians decide they are above that line, they cease to be guardians and become a danger in their own right.